Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Asia Society Korea webinar. My name is Mason Richey from Hanguk University of Foreign Studies and Asia Society Korea here in Seoul, and I'm coming to you from an undisclosed location in order not to compromise sources and methods. As today's webinar is going to be about intelligence collection, espionage, and the spookery in modern intelligence collection. So we're hoping that we're going to get to the bottom of some of the questions of how it is that states spy on each other, both friends and adversaries, why it is that states engage in intelligence collection, how it fits into national strategy and national power, and in some sense, perhaps most importantly, how it is that the business of intelligence collection in all of its different forms has changed over the last few decades, although certainly there's a lot of history and tradition that remains relevant today. So we have three guests who are joining us today, three outstanding specialists. I'll just start in the way that they appear on my camera. We've got Dan Pinkston, who's joining us. He's a lecturer at Troy University, and has previously served as the Deputy Country Director for the International Crisis Group here in Korea. And Dan has both taught and written extensively in terms of his research on intelligence, espionage, and in particular, how that takes place here in Northeast Asia, notably with respect to China. Secondly, we have Bruce Klingner. Bruce Klingner is a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., and is a longtime Korea watcher who lots of people obviously are familiar with, and whose work is widely regarded and widely cited. In addition to his scholarly activities, he spent 20 years plus in the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency, notably looking at Korea and Northeast Asia, but not only. So there's not only the academic expertise coming from Mr. Klingner, but also the practical experience as well. And last, of course, but not least, we have Christian Kaunert, who's joining us from Dublin City University, where he writes on and researches on policing, counter-terrorism, intelligence studies, and has recently been working a lot on what we refer to as critical intelligence studies. And so we're bringing him in as an expert, perhaps, who can talk to us in some ways about some of the ways that intelligence studies have changed in recent years, as well as how the practice has changed as well. So I thank each of you for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and move directly into my first question. And I think I'll throw this out to each of you, and I'm happy for any of you to answer this sort of in whatever order you want. But I think my first question is really sort of a very basic one, and that is, how is it that intelligence, in particular, espionage, fits into national power? How does it help states to assert their interests, maintain their interests, defend their interests, advance their interests? So where does it fit into the national power profile of states?
We could get off into a long conversation about power, which we do in our political science classes or IR classes, and so I don't want to go down that path. But intelligence, what it should do is to provide timely assessments to decision makers so that they can make decisions, more high quality decisions. And that can be in national security, economics, and so forth. You mentioned espionage and state power, so I think this is relegated to the realm of nation states. But structurally, it's similar to how firms would operate in a market, in an oligopolistic market. So when you're engaged in a situation of strategic interaction, no single actor has control over the outcome. So you have to be aware of the actions or behaviors of others, similar with sports teams or what have you. But of course, we're talking about nation states. We're talking about national security, where the stakes are very high.
All right, great. That's a great way to start us off. Bruce, maybe you want to jump in on that. We got a little bit of the academic and the political science part of it. Maybe you can address that part if you want, but maybe also a little bit from the perspective of someone who's served in government, like how it is that intelligence collection feeds into the larger processes of states trying to, or at least the United States, trying to defend and advance its interests.
Yeah, when you mention intelligence being used to maximize national power, it just sort of triggered an analogy. It's like, you can have a really big hammer with, say, a military, but if you don't know where to strike it, then it's much less useful. So, intelligence, we would often think of, well, if the military is the first line of defense for the nation, in a way, the intelligence is the reconnaissance unit of the military or the United States. So, we try to provide information to U.S. policymakers in order to enable them to make the best informed decisions for policy on behalf of the United States. And so we live to serve. And whether that's analysts or operators or logistics, et cetera. So we're trying to enable the U.S. to implement its instruments of national power, diplomatic, information, military, economic, in the most effective way. So we highlight warnings of threats, either near term or long term, but we're also just trying to help inform their decisions. So I was a liaison to more of a economic or commercial agency for a short time, and we were trying to help our negotiators, do the best with foreign negotiators, and that can be information on the other's tactics, the other's objectives, the other's negotiating position, et cetera. So, in a way, we're kind of think like, we're like golden retrievers. We just want to, serve. We just want to be useful. We don't have an agenda of our own, or we shouldn't. Intelligence should never comment on U.S. policy, nor should U.S. policy interfere with intelligence, because it's supposed to be you call the facts as you see them.
If I can hit you with a quick follow-up, and then I'm going to come to you, Christian, because there's something that both Dan and Bruce have said that I think it maybe sort of raises some perspective that you might be able to provide us. But I want just a follow-up for Bruce. You mentioned that you were a liaison for an economically focused consumer of the intelligence, but you were also in the Central Intelligence Agency, and then if I remember correctly, you were also in the Defense Intelligence Agency. Right. Are the ways that you work, as a collector or as an analyst, are they different in those agencies? Is there something that's different about them because of either the culture of the agency or because the product that you're trying to produce? I mean, is there something that distinguishes them, or is it in some ways kind of homogenous?
Well, I'd say they're very similar, because we both go through both CIA and DIA as well as other agencies. Go through the intelligence cycle. You're all driven by kind of standing collection tasking, which is what do the policymakers want? So either through interagency process, et cetera, you've got a standing target list or issues you're focused on. But then there's also ad hoc, where it's like, well, the policymaker doesn't know that he needs to know this yet, but I can provide that information. And so you collect information, you analyze it, you then produce either written or oral products, you disseminate it to the policymakers, then they will either drive additional collection because they say, well, I also need to know this, or you self-identify intelligence gaps where you then need to direct technical or human sources towards filling those intelligence gaps. That said, I think each unit has its own sort of culture. DIA is focused really, their customers are the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and then all the units in the field and the fleet. But CIA's main customer is the President of the United States, and then the principals sort of within the Beltway. So CIA will not only do military analysis, but also political analysis, diplomatic analysis, economic, and leadership. So we have different customers, we have different missions, and there's a bit of cultural difference between the two, but a lot of similarities. But it's your mission is driven by who your main customers are. So State Intelligence and Research Bureau, they're focused on the Secretary of State, so they have a lot more focus on diplomatic activities, not so much military.
Great. I think that's a wonderful jumping off point. Christian, I want to turn to you, briefly. There's something that struck me about, Dan's first answer and to a degree as well, what we've heard from Bruce from his experience within the government. Both of their responses were in some sense, an answer to my question, which focused around the concept of national power. And I know that some of your research actually looks at how intelligence happens outside of that like national framework. So other ways of thinking about who's collecting intelligence and who's analyzing intelligence. So maybe if you can jump in a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the research that you've been doing. I know that you've been, for instance, doing some research on terrorism. So if you want to talk maybe a little bit about how intelligence collection happens outside of the nation state context. And also, perhaps, even terrorist groups. I mean, to what extent do they carry out their own intelligence analysis? And, maybe we don't normally think of that, but, they have their own ways of getting information about how it is that states act and how it is that, militaries act. So if you can maybe talk a little bit about that sort of outside of the state context, that'd be nice.
Absolutely. No, that's great. I'll start a little bit with the relationship with power. Power is, of course, in a sense, a concept that we've talked about for a very long time, and that's kind of at the essence of what I ask scholars look at. It's composed of a variety of different capabilities, whether we look at population, economy, military, and whatever else. All of those, you could perhaps call them structural powers that are inherent. And then intelligence as one of those capabilities to a certain extent is, of course, also an element of power. Perhaps not a structural power, because obviously without all those other powers, intelligence wouldn't be able to do very much. Like Bruce was pointing out, I mean, you need a hammer in order to know where to place the hammer. But it is still, I mean, even in the business world, one might suggest that information is also power, and of course intelligence in that sense is what you might call a situational power. Now, it is something that we've seen over the last decades, that of course traditionally we've always thought, well, it's only states that in a sense do intelligence. But of course, over the last decades, because it is so intrinsically linked to security, to national security, but in a sense, as security changes in its facets and all the kind of elements that we perceive as security, so does intelligence. And that is because it is so linked to security, we see that obviously we have new actors that are doing intelligence. And this is something that we see outside of the academic analysis. This is something that we see in the modern world, that we see private businesses doing intelligence. If you are a multinational company, for instance, and you might have invested very, very heavily in Russia before, it would have paid to know about the outbreak of the war, because you could have made preparations to kind of save your investment just in time. If you are important business and perhaps you are situated in China, it would also help you to know what might be happening in Taiwan. So this is something that obviously also businesses are very, very interested in, and it is very, very important and crucial for their investment. But of course, one dimension is private businesses, multinationals, investment, and so on. Another dimension is, of course, that we see increasingly that foreign policy, if you like, has been disaggregated. I mean, we've talked about it for a little while. In the European Union, we now see that foreign policy decisions increasingly are also taken at the European Union level. We have the European External Action Service. Now, what happens with foreign policy decisions that you need to also have some capabilities, some information in order to base your foreign policy decisions on. So all of that then requires also good intelligence in that sense. We see that variety of different agencies that perhaps were not traditionally seen as intelligence gathering agencies are also gathering intelligence. So for instance, I can tell you that the border agency of the European Union, Frontex, is also gathering intelligence. They're gathering intelligence on migration streams, they're gathering intelligence on smugglers, they're gathering intelligence on all sorts of aspects of the work that they do that is very, very important for them to be able to deal with that. And so what we see is, just as security is in a sense expanding in its realms, we see that in terms of the kind of issues that we are dealing with in terms of intelligence, and security. So one of those issues, for instance, is migration, like I was telling you about, that is an increasingly important one. Another one, of course, just coming out of the pandemic is, of course, health. Health security is, of course, another one that is quite crucial, and it is very important for intelligence agencies to also have good information about what is happening. Should there be another pandemic in the future, and we know that those things, like this was an isolated event, but it might happen again in the future, we still have questions to ask about what exactly happened, where, and so on. So all of these things are crucial in our understanding of intelligence, and so they're also then related both to individual national powers, but also to the power distribution in the international system, the enhanced stability or instability of the international system, and all of those kind of questions.
So can I just hit you with a real brief follow-up and just get a quick answer? I mean, I've got so many questions to ask you at this point. You provoked a lot of thoughts in my head, so I want to move quickly, although not too quickly. To what extent do you think it's the case that these non-state sources of intelligence collection end up crowding out or being perhaps in competition with state intelligence collection? I mean, to what extent, might business intelligence collection end up being a problem for states, or does it go the opposite direction and it is actually augmented and make it better? At some point, I think I'd like to come back to the notion of open source intelligence too, and see maybe how those relate to each other. But just leaving aside the open source part of it and still like looking at it from a sort of proprietary or from a business perspective, if you want to focus on that dimension of it, to what extent are non-state sources of intelligence collection in competition with those of the states, and to what extent are they complementary?
I mean, in my view, I would have thought they're quite complementary. I mean, I was once told that 95% of intelligence collections is mainly open source and all sorts of intelligence that we kind of put a good political picture together. And I think in this way, those private actors, they really help to make all of that intelligence better. I don't see them as being necessarily a competitor. There's, of course, the 5% that is classified, that is secret intelligence, that is also there. And of course, they're not involved in that type of intelligence. So that's very, very clear. They're not able to. But of course, because, like I was saying, the consequences of geopolitical events are massive. They're really very, very significant on companies. It is increasingly important, I think, in the next couple of years, we're going to see more and more companies going to invest in those kind of things, because they can't just bring up somebody in Washington and say, look, what's going to happen with Ukraine, what's going to happen with China. They might well want to, but then don't necessarily get an answer. So obviously, as it matters to them and their investment, they are going to try and find out and try and find ways to get a good picture of what is happening. And nowadays, more than ever, we're able to really get a good picture in a way that perhaps 50 years ago companies couldn't have done, because all of that information is out there. Nowadays, it's not so much getting to the information, but it's making sense of all the information that is actually out there, analyzing it properly, and distinguishing between what is relevant and what is irrelevant kind of information. So that is really the difficulty for the most part. So I think in that sense, those private actors, they're really quite helpful. There will be, of course, perhaps at the margins, be cases of overlaps and where there could also be competition. I think obviously that happens whenever we have different institutions competing slightly for the same turf. But I don't think on the whole that this is such a significant problem, because of course they operate in a different legal framework, they operate in a different regulatory framework. So all of that means that I think they know where their place is, and I think they're operating within that space.
Great, thanks. So I want to go back to Bruce's image of the hammer. I feel like this is maybe going to become the leitmotif of whatever is going to happen for the rest of this conversation. But I want to go back to Bruce's image of the hammer. And I think that kind of already points in the right direction for one of the questions that I was planning on asking. So I think I won't actually end up asking that question. And my question was going to be, well, how does intelligence help states deal with their adversaries. And I think Bruce's question sort of short circuits that to mix metaphors by saying, well, it lets you know where to strike your hammer. So let me instead shift the metaphor to the screwdriver and say, what does intelligence collection do to help states understand and work with their partners? I won't lie, part of the reason why I wanted to have this discussion was because we've just had this big leak, what's being called the Discord leak, where the Pentagon has had something like 50 or 100 mimeographed, if they still do that, pages of intelligence that was leaked out through a series of chat rooms for gamers, and it was notable among other things because there were a number of pieces of secret, in some cases very secret information that was about U.S. friends and allies. And it reminded people, I think, of what we already knew, but perhaps kind of forgot, which is that the U.S. at least does engage in espionage against its friends and allies. At least that appears to be the case. Now, setting that aside, and I want to come back to that question later, but quite apart from the question of why it is that the U.S. might spy on its friends and allies, just in general, how does espionage collection function like a screwdriver in the sense that it gives a state the ability to sort of fine-tune its relationship with its friends and allies? So assuming that all of that intelligence collection remains secret, right? How does that intelligence help the United States or any other country deal better with its allies? Like, how does that give a leg up, not only in terms of how you deal with your adversaries and where to strike the hammer, but where to twist the screwdriver so that you can tighten something up and make the relationship a little bit better, or loosen something up in case there's some tensions there and you need to let some air out of a relationship that might be getting a little bit too tense?
If you just think amongst our friends and allies, is each of us may have an advantage in different kinds of collection. Even within the U.S. intelligence community, often there's sort of a stovepiping where the human intelligence people think that's the most valuable information. The signals intelligence think that's the best. Imagery thinks they're the best, because they all have certain advantages, but also disadvantages. And then open source, I think, is increasingly being incorporated into policymaking and intelligence. But, for example, the U.S. may be very, very good on technical intelligence collection. But against a country like North Korea, we may have very poor human sources. We don't blend in very well, and we don't have an embassy there, et cetera. So South Korea, given its similar ethnicity or same ethnicity and proximity, one might think they could have an advantage on human intelligence. So there could be not necessarily a quid pro quo, but an agreement between our friends and allies of, look, I'll help you with the stuff I'm really good at. You help me with the stuff you're really good at. And collectively, both of us are a lot smarter, or a group is a lot smarter. And therefore, all of our policymakers, our military officials, can be the best that they can be because they all have the best information. So, we do have, formal intelligence agreements with certain countries, and I think also informal. And there can also be very informal in the sense of, hey, I understand you were just in that country. Would you mind if I ask you a few questions? None of it is classified, but you had access that the spooks or the intelligence, technical sources didn't have. So, a good intelligence analyst or a good policymaker tries to get information from all sources and just to come up with the most complete picture. They're like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. The more puzzle pieces you can get, the better off you are in guessing what the final answer is.
I think you get to something there, which I want to come back to, and I think I'll get to in just a minute. And that's, ultimately it's an issue of trust. When you're talking about, perhaps, the U.S. might be better at one thing and South Korea better, at something else, and how they can form complementary outputs. It seems like there's a certain amount of trust that needs to be in play there. And I want to come back to that when we come to the question of the U.S. spying on friends and allies and what that might mean for that trust. But I'll put that aside for just a second. Dan, do you want to chime in on the question of my screwdriver question, or why, how it is that maybe, getting intelligence, helps the U.S. or any other state, deal more effectively with those countries with which it cooperates?
Well, I just reformulate this in many different ways. I just think of this differently structurally in that. So to throw out maybe a different kind of template or model to think about this, if we relegate this or only focus on nation states, I would argue that all nation states have enemies of the state, and they define them differently. Sometimes they are similar, sometimes they're different actors. And states also are looking for, they need the intelligence to defeat, to deter, or manage enemies of the state, and also to seek opportunities and take advantage of opportunities where there are partners or alliance members and so forth, businesses or any other kind of human organization. So those enemies can be domestic enemies, or they can be operating in the international realm. They can be other nation states, terrorist groups, organized crime, narcotics traffickers, and so forth. So different types of states define the enemies differently. For example, in Thailand, what might be, termed just freedom of speech in the US or Canada, or in South Korea, if I were to slander or to insult the monarchy, I would be in trouble and defined as an enemy of the state for, lèse majesté, right? In a one-party state, what might be considered free speech would be a political crime. Alexei Navalny in Russia, for example. Or if you were to oppose the Korean Workers' Party in North Korea, you would be defined an enemy of the state. So within the domestic realm, the intelligence agencies, particularly under authoritarian regimes, they're not constrained by rule of law, legislative and judicial oversight, rules of evidence, and so forth that democracies are supposed to have to constrain these agencies. But in the international system, there's no third-party enforcer, right? Anarchy is the organizing principle. So there's much more lax rules. There are norms that operate. And I guess you're expected to observe the laws in the domestic territory. But if you're outside, then states or nation states are just expected to collect information whenever and however they can. But if you were in South Korea, for example, there are laws against, breaking into computer networks and so forth, privacy protections and so forth. If I were to engage in hacking here from my house in Seoul for intelligence purposes, I would be breaking the law of the Republic of Korea. So I think that's, crossing a red line. So another thing to think about is that states or any actors in the international system, they have different preferences. The preferences don't always align. So sometimes they share views on enemies of the state and might have common enemies, common aversions, and also, opportunities for common collaboration or cooperation. So that's going to be different in a changing dynamic, and decision makers are going to seek intelligence to bolster their decision-making capabilities. So I think that's just expected. What's happened with the US and South Korea, I think a lot of that's overblown. Yes, it can be sensitive and problematic, but it's just the way the world works.
All right, I want to come back to that. We'll get to that right now, but I want to ask one intervening question. You talked about a number of countries, South Korea and Thailand and the US and whatever. Are there different national cultures in intelligence collection? Are there different sort of ways of thinking about it that vary from state to state because of the culture of the agencies involved, or the sort of national cultures? Is there a certain way that states go about it and think about it? I mean, does France's, DSGE, does it operate fundamentally differently from MI6? And does that, operate fundamentally differently from the CIA? Or is it pretty much, as I said earlier, is there sort of homogeneity there?
Well, briefly, and I'll let Bruce and Christian chime in here, but, things matter. The enemies of the state matter. So whether internal or foreign enemies, the neighborhood you live in, right? Costa Rica faces different threats than, India or Pakistan does, for example. So the demands on the demand side, it's going to be different. Some of the, so history path dependency, your security environment, your geography, all in your financial resources, your human resources constrain, what you can do or what resources you have to allocate towards your intelligence processes, intelligence activities. And then also, but there are also, technical constraints. So physics work the same, whether you're in China or Brazil or what have you. So, gathering SIGINT or, satellite imagery or whatever, that's going to be, or cyber intercepts and so forth, that's going to be the same. But the tasking and the collection, the processing, those resources are going to be different. And of course, as I said, the path dependence and the history matters. You look at China, for example, going through the civil wars in the 20th century and everything, the covert operations and sabotage and so forth, the politicization of their intelligence agencies is still relevant today, and it still informs and influences how they collect, how they process, the analysis they do, the biases they have, and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question and kind of hard to know unless you've sort of lived and worked in intelligence agencies from many countries. But, I would think one factor would be, how good is a country's technical collection? And if it's not very good, then you're going to rely on, your friends or allies who could provide you satellite or signals intelligence. And you may be much more reliant on human intelligence, and therefore they may be very good at it. I mentioned sort of the example of the Koreas where they can blend in more with the other country. And also sort of what are the rules, especially a country facing sort of strong domestic terrorism, may have a lot fewer rules on how they gain intelligence than those that don't have that problem and therefore are more focused on maintaining law. So if you have a lot of domestic terrorism, you're not going to worry about, ruffling feathers when you're interrogating prisoners or when you're breaking into houses or when you're gaining intelligence. So, certainly the Soviet Union would be, different in gaining information on domestic issues than, the United States or others. So I think that would be the main factor, the sort of your internal threat perception, also your external threat perception. If you feel you are, an imminent threat from a neighbor or other country, you may be much more aggressive in your technical collection or human collection than other nations.
Yeah, I think, yeah, certainly one answer to that national cultures or national styles question, has something to do with your level of risk acceptance, and that might be driven very much by your threat perceptions. Christian, anything you want to say to that?
There's not terribly much to add there, but obviously there is a national culture to everything. There's a national culture to security. There's a national culture to work. In academia, there's a national culture to writing. So those things exist. So obviously they also influence in terms of intelligence gathering, also in terms of decision making. I mean, how decisions are taken, that's also in a sense varies a little bit across different countries and across different cultures. So obviously that exists. There's obviously also different legislative frameworks. So the legislative framework in each country is a little bit different. So what countries, even those countries that are technically very capable, what maybe they're allowed to be doing is not always the same either. So I think in that sense, it's normal that should vary. So I think that's fine.
Fair enough. Talking to that last point about the legislative issue, that sort of brings up the idea of rule of law, and I can't actually verify this. I have no actual real insight into how true this is, but I've been told that one of the advantages of the Five Eyes is that it essentially might allow some of the members of the Five Eyes to get intelligence on their own populations that they actually couldn't get themselves because their legal frameworks prevent them from spying on their own population in certain cases. I don't know how true that is, but I mean, if that is the case, that would be a sort of interesting way to think about one of the advantages of Five Eyes in addition to all of the other advantages that it provides as well. So I want to hit this question now. Finally, we've had this big leak, the Discord leak, and I'm here in South Korea, as is Dan. Bruce is obviously a longtime South Korea watcher, and of course was himself engaged in intelligence work for the U.S. government, including here in Korea. And South Korea was one of the countries that according to the Discord leaks, was spied on, by the United States, the presidential office here. Why do states, and in this case the United States, but presumably other states as well, engage in espionage against their friends and allies? Is the U.S. alone in this regard? My guess is not, but I'm going to throw that question out there just in case. And assuming that the U.S. Is not alone, how mutually aware are states, the friends and allies and partners? How mutually aware are they of each other and of the spying activity that's going on? What are the norms and practices of friend on friend spying?
I guess I just start with, allegedly spying on each other, so anyway, we'll mark that. Also, I was on the analytic side. I wasn't on the sort of human collection side. Yeah. So that's where all the cool stuff and the secrets are. There's sort of a famous example is back in, I think it was 1930, then Secretary of State Stimson, said, gentlemen do not read each other's mail. And he shut down something called the Black Chamber or the Black Room, where we're doing, I think, signals intelligence against, friends and allies even. That was quickly rescinded because, we live in a dog-eat-dog world. You want to get as much information. To enable your policymakers to make the best decisions possible, you have to get all the information you can. And policymakers don't like to be surprised. You don't want to have I didn't realize our ally was going to do that. Well, that's sort of a reason for finding out what they're doing, whether it's, think back in South Korea when they had a covert nuclear program. Well, we found out about it because presumably we were collecting on them. And that way it prevented a South Korean policy that the U.S. did not want to proceed. So the intelligence in that case drove the diplomacy of getting them to stop it. So I think there's certainly different levels of pushing to get information on countries, depending on the level of mutual trust and the level of transparency between each other. So, one might think the Brits seem to be our closest intelligence allies. So I think there's a much greater, sharing of information and much less of a tendency to want to collect on that other country, whereas other nations that are friends or allies you may feel are not really telling you everything, so you may be a bit more aggressive against them in trying to get information, even though they are, formally or ostensibly your friend.
I just give a couple examples. There was a case during the Obama administration, and it was an important UN Security Council resolution that was coming to a vote, and the U.S. was pressing on diplomacy. I forget the actual issue now, but they were trying to pressure or persuade the UN Security Council members to adopt this resolution, and they didn't know who the holdouts were and what their red lines were and everything else. So anyway, they ended up, collecting some of the message traffic that was going from, through New York out of the UN. And they identified a couple of the countries who were dragging their feet or what the sticking points were. And then they could direct the US diplomats to focus on them and to engage in diplomacy to get this vote. And it ended up, being adopted. But it was very sensitive because under the UN Charter and all of that and the rules, you're not supposed to spy on the UN. And as far as here's another case of friends or allies, I guess, spying on each other or releasing information or collecting information. In 2002, when the U.S. James Kelly, there was that, famous meeting in Pyongyang, and Kelly went and told them that said, yeah, we realize you have a uranium enrichment program. And then the North Korean delegation said, yes, we do. And so the Americans were shocked. We don't have an embassy there. They didn't have the kind of communication capability. So they went to the UK embassy and they sent this message back to DC. They asked the Brits if they could send it. And of course, it was very sensitive information, but the British embassy, they sent it right back to London. Of course, they shared that information. They weren't going to, keep this secret and we'll send this, secretly for you. So that would assist, the UK's awareness, their information about what was going on in North Korea and everything. So, I mean, that just happens. It's how the system, how it works. But I guess there are norms that are generated through these cases and these behaviors. And of course, if you violate laws in the territory of a sovereign nation and it's an ally, if you're breaking into buildings and wiretapping, these things like these Chinese police stations overseas, if the US were doing that in Canada, to collect intelligence, breaking Canadian laws, then I think that's really crossing a red line.
Yeah, so I mean, Christian, I want to hit you with a specific question in just a second. Speaking of technical constraints, my camera is acting up. But Christian, I want to come back and hit you with something specific on this in just a second. But I think Dan, you brought up something I think it's kind of interesting, this idea of red lines and what sort of the norms are for that. And I have a feeling that we sort of think that at least during the Cold War, the U.S. knew that there were Soviet agents that were spying, and that the Soviets were, engaging in, signals intelligence and other forms of intelligence collection against the U.S. And of course, the Soviets knew that the U.S. was doing that too, and it was a sort of cat and mouse game that everyone knew. And I think for your average person, it's harder to imagine like how that can be the case among friends and allies, and to what extent it's just sort of an open secret, and to what extent that's tolerated, and to what extent that's a problem. And I really don't know an answer to that question, or there's not even really a question at all. It's just sort of an interesting remark. And I think that's something that remains this kind of like dark corner of international politics and international security. But to go to the issue of let's say norms and red lines and so on, Christian, you're German, if I remember correctly. I think it was 2015 when the leak came out that the United States had been using some sort of technical gizmo, I don't know what, in order to spy on Angela Merkel's phone, on her mobile phone. How do you think that affects the relationship, for instance, between Germany and the U.S.? I mean, does that have an effect? Is that somehow crossing a red line because you're spying on a leader, or is that fair game? And it's more like that's Germany's fault for not doing a better job of protecting the information that she's giving out over that phone. I mean, to what extent does that cross a red line? To what extent is that fair game? And how do you think that affects the relationship between not only Germany and the U.S., but more broadly, let's say Europe and the U.S.?
Yeah, I think there's different levels to this. I mean, one is the direct level in terms of the statesperson, and there's the level of the kind of partnership in intelligence agencies, and then there's the public at large. Like what's been pointed out before, obviously, foreign policy decision-making is operating under this veil of uncertainty. So you need to know what your adversaries are thinking and doing, but you also need to know what the allies are thinking and doing. There could be an important decision coming up in order to know which people you might still need to convince. You might need to know who's still on your side. So all of that, in a sense, to an extent, is fair game, I would say. And those who have capabilities, they're obviously going to try and find out where they stand in terms of their decision making. So I think that is at that particular moment. There's even elements, let's say, if we're talking hypothetically about Germany and the United States, there are things that perhaps German intelligence agencies are totally unable to do because, of course, the German constitution puts strict limits in terms of what data, what information they can collect. And that poses sometimes very severe problems for them when it comes to detection of terrorists, either domestic radicalization or foreign terrorists who are entering Germany to commit plots and so on. So I think at that particular level of agencies, perhaps, I mean, I wouldn't say this, publicly, but of course, if they were to get certain information then back from the United States that was perhaps processed and already digested for them, and then they're able to use information that they themselves could not have possibly collected, that's certainly helpful. So at that level, perhaps spying on an ally is not necessarily such a negative thing. Now, what does the public make of that, though? Because the public perhaps finds that more complicated to understand, that actually perhaps some decision makers would welcome being spied upon, because that's quite a complicated relationship to explain. So in the general public, obviously that was perceived as something very, very negative when it came out. And I guess it came out also particularly to undermine the relationship between Germany and the United States, with Angela Merkel in particular, because of course Angela Merkel, we should remember, was the chancellor that was very much a transatlantic chancellor, right? When Gerhard Schröder had his summit with Putin and Chirac at the time, she was coming out as the leader of the opposition to say, no, actually, we have to support the United States. So very much meant to undermine her also personally. So this wasn't only an attack, this leak, against the United States. This was also an attack on Angela Merkel to undermine her position within the German political system, when this leak was, in a sense, showing that this has actually happened. Now, do those people perhaps really take offense? Well, perhaps at a certain level, but, again, I'm not privy to her collection of mobile phones, but I suspect she has more than one. Was the information that was actually obtained really that interesting? I'm not aware of it. I don't know. But perhaps it was also overblown, but overblown for a particular purpose, in order to undermine both the relationship between the United States and Germany, and also to undermine Angela Merkel's status within the German political scene. As we remember, at the time, that was also a particular moment for her with the migration crisis and everything else that was going on, where she was already in a tough spot. So I think that was something that was perhaps also deliberate in terms of undermining her position at that particular moment. But in general, in terms of public diplomacy, I think that issue is, of course, a complicated one to explain to people, that actually, on occasions, allies don't even mind being spied upon, because you can't publicly state that, given that it might actually infringe your own constitution.
Fair enough.
If I could just jump in,
Yeah.
Within the intelligence community, there's an 11th commandment: "Thou shalt not get caught." If you do, then it's a problem for the policymakers. So, and knowing how there can be a diplomatic flap if there's an intelligence program, identified, that can lead, well, I don't know, a U.S. ambassador or policymakers might say, look, I don't want to do that because it could cause a flap if it's, revealed. Whereas the answer could come back, well, then I can't give you the best intelligence if you won't let me do that operation. So there's sometimes a tension between, well, you never want to get caught, and because you don't want the consequences, but you also don't want the consequences of not doing the collection, which enables you to identify threats or just to improve your own policymaking.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That trade-off there, I think, is a tough one. You call it attention. I think it's a good word for it, or trade-off. You kind of answered my question a little bit. I guess I'll just throw this out here. I'd like to get us out of here in 3 minutes. But I'll just sort of identify something I think is interesting, and we're seeing kind of play out here in Korea right now is what is the consequence of violating the 11th commandment and getting caught. And so we've seen, at least publicly, the South Korean public react badly to news that the United States has allegedly been spying on the presidential office here in Seoul. And I think there's an interesting question that we unfortunately probably don't have time to get to here, which is how lasting is that damage, if at all? Does it not really ultimately matter, because this is something that takes place in the ethereal realms of elite politics and doesn't really filter down significantly enough to the level of your average citizen that it has much of an effect. But I think it's at least something that's worth thinking about. And here in South Korea, that's been a big deal because this happened, within a few weeks before Yoon going to Washington for, his state visit with President Biden. And, there was some, concern about what sort of, ruffled feathers South Korea was going to bring with it, as they were, decamping for Washington. So basically, I'm going to get us out of here in 2 minutes. It's sort of like a last lightning round. I'll give each of you about 45 seconds to a minute, and hit this last question for me, which is, how has intelligence collection changed in the last few decades? Like, if you can each maybe list, 1, 2, 3 things that have changed in terms of intelligence collection and espionage. It could be technical, it could be something else. Like, what's changed and what's sort of been driving forward, new developments in intelligence collection and espionage in the last few decades. Dan, we're going to start with you. Lightning round, 45 seconds to a minute.
Okay, cyber, much greater access to information, end of the Cold War collapse of the Soviet Union, so many areas that were off limits became accessible. So that's changed the nature of it. And the old problem where intelligence data were scarce, now there's an abundance of it. And the problem is getting through the mountains of haystacks of data and making sense of that. And AI is going to be dealing with those big data sets.
Great, super answer. Bruce.
Satellite imagery, unclassified satellite imagery. I started as a satellite imagery analyst where the government had a monopoly on good satellite imagery. Landsat was, you couldn't use it for intelligence. Now on my phone with Google Earth, I can see things that before only very highly classified systems could see. That both benefits the government and it also makes it difficult for the government. It helps in that it's like, hey, we got more sources we can pull in. Also, you can throw a unclassified imagery in front of a foreign diplomat and say, look, we know you're doing this and I'm not jeopardizing sources. It can also make it more difficult is if you're trying to resolve a situation quietly by calling in the ambassador and say, look, we know you're about to invade your neighbor, don't do it. But now if the unclassified people are leaking it, or not leaking, but revealing it to the New York Times, now you have a diplomatic crisis that maybe you could have resolved quietly.
Excellent answer. Thank you. Well, those 2 answers are really good. Christian, you got a lot of pressure on you to answer well.
Well, I think I agree with everything that's been said, but of course, what's also interesting is, of course, the range of topics that we're collecting intelligence on. I think that is something, a much, much broader range. We're now no longer only collecting information on geopolitics, military matters, and so on. We're collecting stuff on health intelligence, on migration, on economic intelligence, on all sorts of different topics that we didn't in the past, or perhaps only rudimentary intelligence, maybe not even reaching the level of actual intelligence, more like a reporting. Now have like proper intelligence, you can actually gather all of that information. And like it's been said before, the crux now is to actually properly analyze it. It's not really getting to it, it's really making sense of it. That is the big question for the future.
Super. Those were 3 really excellent answers to what I thought was going to be a pretty tough question for you at the end, but you breezed through it like a hot knife through butter. I don't know about the viewers out there, but I certainly feel like I'm smarter coming out of this than I was going into it. So this has captured all forms of intelligence, whether that be the term that we normally think of in terms of spooks and spies and espionage, or intelligence in terms of listening to these 3 experts who can make us smarter. So I want to thank Dan Pinkston and Bruce Klingner and Christian Kaunert for joining me today for this discussion for the Asia Society Korea on intelligence in the contemporary context. So thanks to everyone for joining, and we hope to see you at another Asia Society Korea webinar in the future. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.